Layla and James have always been passionate explorers of the weird. Their channel on the video platform with the concise name Real Alarm grew thanks to their courage to visit abandoned buildings, arrange night shifts in supposedly cursed places, and sort out strange, at first glance, incidents. But their popularity wasn't growing fast enough for them to relax. The competition was fierce, and dozens of new channels appeared every month, copying their style. One of their followers was a user with the nickname Sentinel_X, who often left them tips on suspicious places. He wrote cryptic messages. "Are you looking for the real thing? Try to figure out what's hiding outside. Look at the case at the former Ridgeway Research Center." James was immediately interested. Layla, on the other hand, was skeptical. She knew perfectly well that such leads usually lead to collapsed houses or rumors without real evidence. But James still persuaded her to check it out. A few days later, they stood in front of a dilapidated building hidden deep in the forest. It was far from a typical abandoned place. There was a sign at the entrance with the inscription, "Ridgeway Experimental Center. Access is prohibited." "What a find," James muttered, holding up the camera. Layla nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. Before entering, they noticed strange footprints around the building. The grass around was flattened, although the center had long been abandoned. They noticed several plastic wrappers and a bottle of water by a wall partially littered with old boards. "Someone was here recently," Layla whispered. James grinned. "Or it's leftovers from the hunters." "Relax. The main thing is the content." Inside, the atmosphere was even stranger. At first, they were greeted by typical paintings for such places. Garbage, faded papers, moldy furniture. But the deeper they went, the stronger the feeling became that someone was still working here even after the official closure. There was a board with magnets on one wall, where the records were still displayed. "Stage 3 is completed. The trial results are unstable. The evacuation will begin at 4 o'clock. There was a battered notebook on the floor next to her. Layla picked it up and ran her eyes over the pages. The recordings mentioned some kind of experiments on the mental state of people. Exposure to sound, isolation, sleep deprivation. "I don't like this, James. There's more to it than the old center." He just waved his hand, fascinated by the inspection of the huge laboratory hall. On the tables, covered with a layer of dust, there were still strange devices. Some of them looked like helmets with wires, others resembled breathing masks connected to bulky metal boxes. It was here that they found the first note. "The experimental protocol has been violated. The remaining participants exhibit extreme aggression and uncontrollable behavior. Immediate isolation is not possible. Further presence in the sector is prohibited." "Did they torture people?" gasped Layla. "It doesn't look like anyone died," James replied, filming the note. Down the hall they found a door that was tightly locked with several locks. There was a sign on it, "Sector 4. Authorized personnel only." Layla felt her body go cold. She had almost persuaded James to turn around when she noticed that he had taken out a tire iron to break open the door. "Are you crazy? Lay, if there's something real out there, this is our chance. We can't stop now." When the door opened with a bang, icy air blew in from inside. Inside, a narrow corridor was revealed, illuminated by the dim light of old lamps. James whispered, although he didn't look so sure himself. Layla sighed, picked up the camera and stepped after him. The corridor seemed endless, and the silence became almost deafening. Layla tried to focus on shooting, but her fingers were shaking and the camera was constantly shaking. James, in front of her, tried to maintain his confidence, but every step echoed hollowly, which increased the tension. The walls gradually changed from shabby to perfectly clean. The light grew brighter, but its cold bluish nature only increased the feeling of discomfort. Strange footprints appeared on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged across the entire corridor. "Do you see this?" Layla pointed to a long scratch that ran along the wall. James bent down to examine her. Maybe the equipment was moved? He did not have time to finish, as a quiet, barely audible buzzing attracted their attention. "Is that electricity?" "I don't know. But it works, and it's weird," he replied, clutching the flashlight. After a few minutes, they reached a hall that was completely different from what they had seen before. It looked like it had just been abandoned. Monitors were blinking, papers were on the tables, and several chairs were carelessly pushed aside. An inscription lit up on one of the monitors. "Protocol 17 is activated. Maintaining control is impossible." "James, I don't want to be here," Layla's voice faltered. "We need to understand what happened here," he replied and began to inspect the tables. They found a folder with photos on one of them. The pictures showed people connected to strange devices. There was despair in the eyes of each of them. There was a note on the back of one of the photos. Object 4B. He is prone to disorientation, partial memory loss, inadequate reactions to stimuli. James flipped through the photos until he found one with a caption. Object 7F. The critical stage. It is subject to isolation. Further experiments are prohibited. There was a man in the photo who looked almost like a shadow of himself, with an empty, lifeless expression on his face. "This is too much, James. Let's go." Layla came closer and pulled on his sleeve. "Wait, we haven't found anything concrete. There must be an explanation." He noticed another door, partially open. There was a small office with a computer behind it. The monitor was glowing, and a folder with documents was open on the screen. James started flipping through them. The protocols of the exposition have been completed. The participants demonstrated a high level of mental and physical abnormality. Sector 4 is isolated. Access is only with the personal permission of the management. "Someone clearly knew they were doing something illegal," he said, including one of the videos saved on the computer. A man in a white coat appeared on the screen. He spoke in a nervous voice. "This experiment is out of control. We can no longer ignore the consequences. The participants show aggression that cannot be controlled. One of them is... He just disappeared. The rest will have to..." The recording stopped. "Damn," James slammed on the table. "James, this all smells bad. We already have the material. Let's just leave. Wait, there should be a log here." At that moment, they heard a thud, as if something heavy had fallen somewhere nearby. "Did you hear that?" Layla nodded, her face pale. They froze, listening. The sound was repeated, closer this time. "We have to leave right now," she whispered. James didn't argue. They ran back out into the hallway and headed for the exit. However, the further they went, the stronger the feeling that someone was following them. Layla turned around and froze. At the end of the corridor, she saw a dark figure standing motionless, as if watching them. "Let's run." They were running as fast as they could, but the corridors seemed to be getting longer. Layla was breathing heavily, her camera slung over her shoulder, hitting her hip with every step. When they finally reached the main hall, the door they had entered through was closed. James began to jerk the handle convulsively. "Open up!" But the door wouldn't budge. James was frantically banging on the door, desperately trying to open it. Layla stood behind him, gasping for air and turning back in panic. The dark figure she had seen in the hallway was no longer visible, but her absence was even more frightening. "Damn, it's jammed!" James shouted, leaning on the handle with all his weight. "We can't stay here." "Look for another way out," cried Layla. Her voice broke and she sobbed. They ran along the walls of the hall, but all the windows were boarded up and the doors were tightly locked. A strange vibration gradually began to be felt in the air, as if massive machines were working somewhere. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps came from the corridor through which they had come. A dull, slow, measured thud, as if someone deliberately took their time, enjoying their fear. Layla grabbed James's arm. "This way." She pulled him towards the stairs leading to the upper floor. On the second floor, the situation was even worse. The air became damp, the walls were covered with condensation, and the light blinked so that the eyes began to hurt. "Let's just hide," Layla whispered, not a hint of confidence left in her voice. James didn't answer, but he was visibly nervous. They took refuge in a small room that looked like a security room. A glass wall gave an overview of the corridor outside. "What was that?" whispered Layla, breathing heavily. James put a finger to his lips, calling her to silence. Suddenly, they heard a strange sound, a creaking and cracking sound, as if someone had run their nails over the glass. Layla froze, staring wide-eyed at the door. "James." Her voice was trembling. He turned around and saw a shadow glide past the glass wall. It was something huge, human, but with disproportionately long limbs. "What the—" James began, but didn't have time to finish. Suddenly, the door of the security room burst open with a bang. James grabbed a chair that was standing by the table and swung. There was nothing in the doorway. Layla was on the verge of sobbing. "We have to get out of here," James breathed. They ran on, racing through the corridors. In each of them, the walls seemed to be getting closer, and the air became more and more suffocating. Finally, they found another door with a bright yellow sign saying, "Evacuation exit." "Come on," cried Layla, rushing to the handle. But when the door opened, it turned out not to be a street, but a narrow descent down to some kind of basement. "This is a mistake. We're in the wrong place," James whispered, trying to close the door. But at that moment, there was a sound behind them. Footsteps, fast and confident. "We can't stay here," cried Layla, grabbing James by the arm and pulling him down the stairs. The basement turned out to be a huge maze of pipes covered with rust and green mold on the walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, making loud bangs in the silence. They stopped to catch their breath. Layla was breathing heavily, leaning against the wall, and James was squatting down, trying to look around. "It should be here. Some way out," he muttered, peering into the darkness. Suddenly, Layla heard something behind them. She turned around and saw that a thick, black liquid was leaking out of one of the pipes. She moved as if she were alive, as if she were crawling across the floor towards them. "What is it?" she screamed, grabbing James by the shoulder. He turned around and saw the liquid rapidly approaching. They jumped up and ran, but the corridors seemed to become endless. At some point, they noticed a massive metal door. James leaned on it with all his might, and it opened with a bang. Beyond the door was a tunnel leading to the forest. They ran outside, trembling with fear, and collapsed to the ground when they finally felt the fresh air. They turned back and saw the metal door slowly slam shut by itself. "What was that?" cried Layla. "I don't know. But we should never come back here," James replied, breathing heavily. Layla and James were sitting at the exit of the tunnel, trying to catch their breath. The sense of salvation was deceptive. The forest around them looked wild and inhospitable. The trees towered like walls, hiding the sky. "Do you think someone is following us?" asked Layla, her voice low but filled with panic. "I do not know," James replied, wiping his forehead. "But we have to get as far away from here as possible. This tunnel, I'm sure he's here for a reason." They got up and walked along the path, hoping that it would lead them to civilization. The forest was filled with sounds, the crackling of branches underfoot, muffled rustling in the bushes. Layla kept turning around, feeling like she was being targeted by invisible eyes. A few minutes later, they noticed a small house standing on the edge of the forest. "James, is there someone there who can help? Or it's a trap," he muttered, but despite his words, he headed for the house. The door was ajar, and it was dark inside. There was dirt on the floor and the smell of rot in the air. "Hello? Is anyone there?" James shouted, cautiously stepping inside. No one answered. The house turned out to be abandoned, but there were things on the table that looked too new. a backpack, a half-empty bottle of water, and a phone. Layla grabbed the phone and checked it. The battery was almost empty, but the screen lit up and she saw an open message. "We've gone too far." He said it was an experiment, but something went wrong. "If you're reading this, leave. There will be no help." She showed the message to James. "It's definitely connected to that building," he said, glancing at the backpack. Inside, they found a map with a marked point near their current location. "It could be an exit or a shelter," James said. "Or another trap," Layla countered. "We have no choice." He took out a map and headed for the door. Layla reluctantly followed him. They continued to move through the forest, guided by the map. The road became more and more difficult. Deep pits appeared underfoot. The trees grew so densely that they had to climb through the branches. A few hours later, they came out into a clearing, in the center of which was a strange structure, a metal container with a massive lock. "It looks like a shelter," James said, looking around. They came closer and noticed that the castle was broken. The container door was open, but the inside was empty. Only the walls were covered with strange markings, as if someone had scratched them in desperation. They found an old notebook on the floor. James picked it up and started flipping through it. There were notes on the first page. "They used us. They said it was all for the sake of science. But none of us signed up for this. We are victims, and we will not get out." The next pages were filled with incoherent words, and the last entry read, "Those who survived have become worse than the dead." "Things are only getting worse here," Layla whispered, stepping back from the container. "We have to find a way out of the woods," James said, throwing away the notebook. Suddenly, they heard a loud crackling of the trees behind them. James turned sharply, but saw no one. "Let's run," he said, grabbing Layla's hand. They ran as fast as they could, weaving through the trees. There were strange sounds behind them, either footsteps or the fall of something heavy. When they ran out into another clearing, their breathing was short and their legs were weak from fatigue. But there was another obstacle in front of them, a deep ravine with boiling water below. "The only way to cross it is a narrow, old bridge." "We have to take a chance," James said, taking the first step. Layla followed him, trying not to look down. The bridge creaked and swayed, but it held their weight. When they were in the middle, a loud scream filled with rage and pain rang out in the forest. Layla froze, and the bridge began to sway under her feet. James shouted, holding out his hand to her, but her feet seemed rooted to the bridge. She was looking towards the forest, where something was coming out. Not a man, but a distorted silhouette, with a bald head and unnatural movements. "Layla, come on." James managed to grab her and drag her forward. When they reached the other side, the bridge collapsed. The silhouette remained on the other side of the ravine, frozen at the edge. Layla and James collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, as the bridge behind them collapsed into a ravine. They couldn't take their eyes off the side where the thing was standing, but when they blinked, the figure disappeared. What was that?" Layla barely breathed out, her voice trembling with shock. "I don't know, but it's not following us." James looked around. The forest ahead seemed less dense, but it was felt that this was not the end of their suffering. They walked without talking. The forest finally began to part, and soon they came to the road. The asphalt looked cracked, but it was a clear road to salvation. "Are we saved?" asked Layla, her voice sounding almost incredulous. James laughed hoarsely. "It looks like it." They walked along the road until they noticed a car parked on the side of the road. The hood was ajar, as if the driver was trying to fix it, but disappeared. "Let's check it out," James said, looking around. Layla wanted to object, but agreed. They approached the car. The door was unlocked, the keys were left in the ignition. In the glove compartment, James found a map where their current neighborhood was marked. "This road leads to the highway. We can get to him in this car," he suggested. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Layla was clearly hesitating. "We have no choice," he said, getting behind the wheel. They drove off. The forest seemed endless, but after a few hours the asphalt became smoother, and signs appeared leading to a large city. Layla began to relax, feeling the weight go off her shoulders. When they entered the city, they were greeted by empty streets. No people, no cars, just the wind-rolling debris along the road. "Where is everyone?" asked Layla. James stopped the car and got out. Looking around, he noticed strange footprints on the ground, as if a crowd of barefoot people had passed through here. "Maybe there was an evacuation," he suggested, although there was no certainty in his voice. They went to the nearest building, a large supermarket with broken windows. Inside, the storefronts were empty, but there was no chaos or signs of violence. There was a poster on the wall. "The experiment is over. All participants must return to Zone A." James stared at the text, trying to figure out what it meant. "Zone A? What are they talking about?" asked Layla. But James was already looking at the walls and noticed another inscription scratched on the bricks. "You've never been free." Layla's hands were shaking. She pulled James towards the exit. "We need to get out of here. This is some kind of... this? Let's just leave." They ran outside and jumped back into the car. James turned the key and the engine started. But when they drove a few kilometers away, a column of military vehicles appeared in front of them. The man in the uniform motioned for them to stop. James obeyed, slowly getting out of the car. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to speak calmly. The soldier came closer, taking a notebook from his belt. "You crossed the border of a zone that was under experimental supervision. Congratulations. You have witnessed the end of it. Please come with us for a briefing." "What experiment? We're here by accident. We are not participants." Layla was indignant. The man frowned. "Everyone who happens to be in this area is part of the experiment. Now you are our data. Don't worry, everything will be documented." James and Layla exchanged glances. Their hearts froze when they realized that they had no choice. The military took them to one of their camps. There they were met by doctors who examined them, asking strange questions about what they saw and how they reacted. They were not given time to ask questions. At one point, Layla asked, "And what will happen now? Can we go back home?" The doctor, adjusting his glasses, replied, "The house? No, your home is here now. You are part of a new stage." James grabbed Layla's hand, squeezing it until it hurt. He knew that all their efforts to get out of the forest were in vain. They didn't escape. They just moved from one cell to another.